when my son Marcus said, "Mom, you forgot to take your pills again," while I stood there holding my morning coffee, watching him roll his eyes like I was some confused child, I smiled sweetly and said, "You're absolutely right, honey." What he didn't know was that later that same day, I would also forget something else, to transfer the money for his mortgage payment that was due the next morning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Chen, and at 68 years old, I had become the kind of woman people talked around instead of talking to. I lived in Clearwater, Florida, in a little guest house behind my son's main property, where the morning sun filtered through palm fronds and the air always carried the faint scent of salt from the Gulf. For 3 years now, this had been my reality, close enough to help, far enough to be forgotten. I used to be a real estate agent, one of the top sellers in Pinellas County for 15 consecutive years. My business cards were tucked into wallets all over the Tampa Bay area, and my photos smiled from bus stop benches and grocery store bulletin boards. I knew every neighborhood, every school district, every quirk that made a house a home. I wore sharp blazers and carried leather portfolios, and when I walked into a room, people listened. That was before my husband Robert died of a heart attack while trimming our hedge on a Tuesday morning in April. That was before Marcus decided I shouldn't live alone in our big house on the water. That was before I sold everything I'd built and moved into this converted pool house that smelled perpetually of chlorine and had windows too small to let in enough light. The guest house wasn't terrible, I told myself daily. It had a kitchenette with a half-sized refrigerator, a bathroom with a shower that never quite got hot enough, and a main room that served as bedroom, living room, and office all at once. Marcus had painted it a cheerful yellow before I moved in, thinking it would make me happy. Instead, it reminded me of the color of caution tape. The main house, where Marcus lived with his wife Jennifer and their twin boys, sat just 50 feet away across a perfectly manicured lawn, close enough that I could hear Jennifer's morning yoga videos through their kitchen window, close enough that I could smell when they grilled steaks on Sunday evenings, close enough to know that my grandsons, 8-year-old Tyler and Connor, had friends over by the volume of their laughter echoing across the yard. But somehow I had become distant from it all, a satellite orbiting their real life. It started innocently enough. Jennifer would call across the yard in the mornings, asking if I could watch the boys after school, because she had a client meeting. I said yes, of course. Then Marcus began leaving his mail on my little porch table when packages were too big for their mailbox. I brought them in without complaint. Soon, I was folding their laundry because Jennifer mentioned she was overwhelmed, and I was grocery shopping for them because I was already going to Publix anyway. I didn't mind helping. I was a mother, a grandmother. This is what family does. But somewhere in the endless cycle of small favors, I stopped being Margaret and became Mom who lives out back. I stopped being a person with my own schedule and became the person who was always available. I stopped being someone who had built a career and a life and became the woman who had nothing better to do. The pill comment wasn't the first time Marcus had spoken to me like I was losing my mind. It started about 6 months ago, right around the time I'd gotten my hair cut shorter and stopped wearing makeup every day. He began watching me differently, like he was cataloging evidence of my decline. When I forgot to return a phone call immediately, he'd ask if I was feeling all right. When I chose to wear comfortable shoes instead of heels to dinner, he'd comment that I seemed to be letting myself go. When I decided to skip their neighborhood barbecue because I preferred reading on my porch, he and Jennifer exchanged those looks, the kind married couples share when they're having a conversation without words. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The morning he made the pill comment, I had been standing in their kitchen making breakfast for the boys because Jennifer had an early appointment and Marcus was already at work. I'd done this routine hundreds of times: scrambled eggs, toast cut into triangles, orange juice in their favorite cups with the superhero logos. I knew exactly how each boy liked his eggs, knew that Tyler always ate his toast crusts and Connor never did, knew that they both preferred their juice with exactly 3 ice cubes. But that morning I had put Connor's juice in Tyler's cup, and Tyler's in Connor's. A simple mix-up, the kind anyone might make when they're thinking about something else. I was thinking about the letter I'd received from my old real estate office. Actually, they were having a reunion luncheon and wanted to honor their longtime top performers. I was wondering if I should go, if I still belonged in that world, if those people would even remember who I used to be. Marcus walked into the kitchen just as Tyler was politely asking if he could trade cups with his brother. My son surveyed the scene, the slightly mixed-up breakfast, me standing there in my bathrobe and slippers, my hair uncombed because I hadn't expected anyone but the boys to see me, and that's when he said it. Not with malice, not with anger, but with the patient, condescending tone people use when they're talking to someone they believe is no longer quite capable. "Mom, you forgot to take your pills again." I wasn't taking any pills. My health was fine. My mind was fine. I had simply mixed up 2 cups while thinking about something else, the way people do thousands of times every day without having their mental capacity questioned. But in that moment, standing in that kitchen wearing my bathrobe at 7:30 in the morning, I realized how I must look to him, how I must have been looking to him for months. I had become the confused elderly mother who needed to be managed. The boys finished their breakfast and kissed my cheek before grabbing their backpacks and racing out to catch the school bus. Marcus poured himself coffee in a travel mug and grabbed his keys from the counter. Before leaving, he turned back to me with that same patient expression. "Maybe you should make a doctor's appointment," he said gently, "just to check your blood pressure or whatever. And Mom, maybe don't make breakfast tomorrow morning. Jennifer will handle it." He left through the garage, and I stood alone in their bright, clean kitchen with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. Everything was perfect, organized, exactly as it should be. Everything except me. I walked back to my little yellow guest house and sat at the small table by the window. Outside, a mockingbird was building a nest in the hibiscus bush, flying back and forth with twigs and string, working methodically to create something that was hers. I watched her for a long time, admiring her determination, her absolute certainty about what she was doing. Then I opened my laptop and logged into the online banking system, where I managed Marcus's mortgage payments. For 3 years, I had been helping with his finances. It started when he bought the house and was overwhelmed by all the paperwork and payment schedules. I had experience with real estate transactions, so I offered to help set up automatic payments and keep track of due dates. Gradually, I had become the person who managed most of his monthly bills. I transferred money from his account to mine, then paid his mortgage, utilities, insurance, and credit cards. It was easier for everyone, he said, more organized. I stared at the computer screen, at the mortgage payment that was scheduled to be transferred that afternoon. $3,200, due to SunTrust by 5 p.m. tomorrow. I had never missed a payment, never been late, never made an error in 3 years of managing his financial obligations. My finger hovered over the mouse. The mockingbird outside had finished her nest and was sitting in it, looking proud and settled and completely in control of her own space. I closed the laptop without making the transfer. The next day was Thursday. I woke early, made myself coffee in my little kitchenette, and sat on my tiny porch watching the sunrise paint the sky pink and orange over Tampa Bay. The water stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and somewhere out there people were starting fishing boats and planning adventures and living lives that belonged entirely to themselves. Around 10 a.m., Marcus's car pulled into the driveway. He worked from home on Thursdays, so this wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that instead of going into his house, he walked directly across the lawn to my guest house and knocked on the door. I opened it to find him holding his phone, his face flushed with the kind of stress that comes from unexpected problems. "Mom, did you forget to pay the mortgage yesterday?" I blinked at him innocently. "Did I forget what?" "The mortgage. I just got a call from the bank saying the payment is overdue. You always handle it on Wednesdays." I touched my temple and frowned slightly, as if trying to remember. Oh my goodness, what day is it? I've been so confused lately. The expression that crossed his face was a mixture of frustration and what he probably thought was compassion. He stepped inside my small space, looking around as if seeing it for the first time. The cramped quarters, the single bed that doubled as a couch, the card table where I ate my meals and managed his entire financial life. "Mom, this is exactly what I was talking about yesterday. You're forgetting important things. Maybe we should look into getting you some help, or maybe there's a nice assisted living place. I let him talk while I poured myself another cup of coffee, moving slowly and deliberately, playing the part he had written for me, the confused elderly mother who couldn't be trusted with simple tasks, the woman who needed to be managed and contained, and possibly relocated to somewhere more appropriate for someone in her declining condition. When he finished his speech about getting me the support I need, I looked up at him with clear, steady eyes. "Marcus," I said, "I didn't forget to pay your mortgage." He blinked. "But the bank said, I chose not to pay your mortgage. Just like you chose to speak to me yesterday morning like I was a confused child who couldn't be trusted to put juice in the right cup." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Outside, I could hear Jennifer starting her car, probably heading to another one of her appointments. The boys' voices drifted from the backyard where they were playing before school. "I don't understand," Marcus said finally. "For 3 years, I've been living in this pool house, managing your finances, watching your children, folding your laundry, and gradually disappearing from my own life. Yesterday morning, you decided I was becoming incompetent because I mixed up 2 juice cups. Today, you're suggesting assisted living because I finally stopped doing something I was never obligated to do in the first place." I walked to the small closet and pulled out a folder thick with bank statements, payment confirmations, and financial records. I set it on the card table between us. "These are copies of every payment I've made for you over the past 3 years. Every mortgage payment, every utility bill, every insurance premium. I've saved you approximately $600 in late fees and service charges by managing these accounts. I've never missed a deadline, never made an error, never cost you a penny." Marcus opened the folder, flipping through pages of meticulous record-keeping. "I've also been transferring money from your account to mine to make these payments, which means you've been trusting me with access to approximately $40,000 every month. If I were really becoming incompetent, would you want someone with dementia handling that much of your money?" He looked up from the papers, and for the first time in months I saw something in his eyes that wasn't patience or pity. It might have been respect. It might have been fear. "The payment will be 3 days late," I continued. "According to your mortgage agreement, you have a 10-day grace period before any penalties apply. You can log into your account right now and make the payment yourself, the way people did for thousands of years before their mothers moved into their pool houses." I walked to the door and opened it, letting in the warm Florida air and the sound of the mockingbird, who was now singing from her nest with obvious satisfaction. "I'm going to drive to Sarasota today to visit my friend Patricia. I'll be back Sunday evening. I trust you can figure out how to pay your own bills for the next few days without any assistance from someone who's apparently losing her mental capacity." Marcus stood in my doorway, holding the folder, looking like a man who had just realized he'd been solving the wrong problem entirely. "Mom, I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did, and that's okay, but now we both know where we stand." I picked up my purse and car keys from the small table by the door. My hands weren't shaking. My voice was steady. I felt more like myself than I had in months. "Oh, and Marcus? I won't be watching the boys after school today. Jennifer will need to figure that out herself." I walked past him, across the lawn to where my car was parked in the driveway. As I backed out, I could see him still standing in the doorway of the guest house, papers in his hand, probably trying to understand how his confused, declining mother had just delivered the clearest communication they'd had in years. I drove toward Sarasota with the windows down, letting the Gulf breeze blow through my hair. For the first time in 3 years, I had nowhere I needed to be, no one else's schedule to accommodate, no tasks waiting that someone else had decided I should handle. I had forgotten to pay the mortgage. And I had remembered who I used to be. The drive to Sarasota took 2 hours, but I stretched it into 4 by stopping at places I hadn't visited in years. A roadside stand selling fresh strawberries and orange blossom honey. A small art gallery in Bradenton where local artists displayed watercolors of egrets and sunsets. A coffee shop overlooking the Manatee River, where I sat by the window and watched boats drift past while I drank the best Cuban coffee I'd had since Robert and I used to drive down to Key West. At each stop, I noticed something I had forgotten about myself. I still loved talking to strangers about their work, their art, their stories. The gallery owner spent 20 minutes telling me about the woman who painted the egrets, how she woke every morning at dawn to watch the birds fish in the shallows. The farmer at the strawberry stand remembered me from years ago when I used to bring Robert here, and he asked about my husband with genuine warmth. When I told him Robert had passed, he squeezed my hand and said he was sorry for my loss, then gave me an extra jar of honey. Because life's too short for small portions of sweetness. I had forgotten how much I enjoyed these kinds of conversations. In the guest house, in Marcus's world, my interactions had become functional, transactional. Can you watch the boys? Can you pick up the dry cleaning? Can you remember to take your pills? But here, talking to people who didn't know I was supposed to be declining, I remembered that I was still interesting. I still had opinions and observations and stories worth telling. Patricia lived in a retirement community in Sarasota, but not the kind Marcus had probably been picturing when he mentioned assisted living. This was a place where 70-year-olds taught yoga classes, and 80-year-olds organized book clubs and wine tastings. Patricia had moved there 2 years ago after her husband died, not because she needed care, but because she wanted community without the burden of maintaining a house. She was waiting for me in the lobby when I arrived, wearing bright coral pants and a white linen shirt, her silver hair cut in a stylish bob that made her look sophisticated rather than elderly. She hugged me fiercely and immediately started critiquing my appearance. "Margaret Chen, you look like you've been hiding under a rock. When was the last time you had your hair done properly? And what is this outfit? You used to dress like someone who owned the world." I looked down at my faded capri pants and oversized t-shirt, the uniform I'd adopted for my life in the guest house. Comfortable clothes for a woman who wasn't going anywhere important, who wasn't seeing anyone who mattered. "I've been living small," I admitted. "Well, we're gonna fix that immediately. Come on." Patricia led me to her apartment, which was bright and airy with a view of a golf course and a small lake where ibises waded in the shallows. Her walls were covered with photographs from travels she'd taken since moving here: Ireland, Morocco, New Zealand. Her bookshelf held novels I'd never heard of, and travel guides to places I'd only dreamed about visiting. "I thought you moved here to be safe," I said, looking at a photo of her, standing beside a camel. "Safe from what? Boredom? Adventure? The possibility that I might actually enjoy the rest of my life?" She handed me a glass of wine and settled into the chair across from me. "Margaret, I moved here to be free. There's a difference." Over dinner at the community center, I met Patricia's neighbors. Eleanor, who had started learning Spanish at 75 and now spent her winters teaching English in Guatemala. Bob and Janet, who had sold their house and bought an RV and were currently planning a trip to Alaska. Marie, who had never painted in her life until she moved here and now had her watercolors hanging in 3 local galleries. These were people who had looked at the phase of life Marcus would call decline and decided to call it possibility instead. "The secret," Eleanor told me over dessert, "is realizing that your children's anxiety about your aging is not your problem to solve. They're worried about losing you, so they try to wrap you in cotton and keep you safely contained. But a life without risk is not a life at all." "My daughter wanted me to move in with her family," Bob added. "She was convinced I couldn't handle living alone after Janet passed. Know what convinced her otherwise?" "I planned a solo road trip to Yellowstone. Nothing says I'm fine, like driving 2,000 miles by yourself to look at geysers." I told them about the mortgage, about the pills, about living in the guest house and gradually becoming invisible. They listened without offering solutions or platitudes, and when I finished, Marie raised her wine glass. "To forgetting to pay the mortgage," she said. "To remembering who you are," Patricia added. We clinked glasses, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not a dramatic transformation, just a small door opening to let in air and light. That night, I slept in Patricia's guest room on sheets that smelled like lavender and salt air. The bed was comfortable, the room was quiet, and for the first time in months, I woke naturally instead of to the sound of my phone buzzing with requests and reminders from Marcus's household. Patricia had already left for her morning walk, but she'd left coffee made and a note suggesting I join the community's Saturday morning book club if I was interested. I was interested. It had been 3 years since I'd read a book that wasn't a quick escape from my shrinking life. The book club was discussing a novel about a woman who left her marriage at 60 to travel through France alone. The discussion was passionate, intelligent, full of people who understood that stories about reinvention weren't just entertainment but blueprints for possibility. "The thing about getting older," said a woman named Dorothy, is that everyone assumes you're winding down when you might actually be gearing up. I got my pilot's license at 68. My children thought I'd lost my mind. Had you? Asked another woman, laughing. Absolutely. I'd lost the part of my mind that said I was too old, too careful, too responsible to do something just because I wanted to. After the book club, Patricia and I walked through St. Armand's Circle, looking at art galleries and boutiques. She insisted on buying me a new outfit, a flowing sundress in deep blue with sandals that had small heels and made me feel elegant again. When I protested that I had nowhere to wear something so nice, she looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. You don't need somewhere to go to deserve beautiful clothes. You wear them because you're worth wearing them. That afternoon, we sat by the community pool reading our books and occasionally talking to the other residents who stopped by. I learned that the man doing laps used to be a federal judge, that the woman reading under the umbrella had been a pilot during World War II, that the couple playing chess had met here 2 years ago and gotten married last month at ages 79 and 81. These were people who had decided that the narrative about aging, that it meant becoming less, needing more help, preparing for the end, was optional. They had written different stories for themselves. On Sunday morning, Patricia and I drove to the beach at Siesta Key. The sand was white and soft, and the water was the color of emeralds. I hadn't been to the beach in over a year, not since I'd moved into the guest house and my world had contracted to the space between Marcus's backyard and the grocery store. We walked along the shoreline, our feet sinking into the cool sand, while pelicans dove for fish and children built elaborate castles that would be gone by evening. The horizon stretched endlessly in both directions, and standing there I felt the same sense of possibility I used to feel when I was showing houses to young families, helping them imagine the futures they could build. I used to love my work, I told Patricia as we found a spot to sit and watch the waves. I was good at it. I helped people find homes, start new chapters. I was never the most charming agent or the most aggressive, but I understood something about matching people with places where they could flourish. What happened to that woman? Patricia asked. She got tired. Then she got sad. Then she got small. I picked up a shell, smooth and gray with hints of pink inside. When Robert died, I felt like I'd lost my partner in everything. We'd built our life together, and without him, I didn't know how to inhabit it alone. When Marcus offered to let me move to the guest house, it felt like a kindness. I thought it would be temporary, just until I figured out what came next. But you never figured out what came next. I stopped trying to figure it out. It was easier to just help with their lives than to build my own. Patricia was quiet for a moment, watching a sandpiper race the waves. When I moved to the retirement community, my kids were horrified. They said it was like giving up, like admitting I was old. But it was the opposite. It was admitting I was still alive. We sat in comfortable silence, letting the sound of the waves fill the space between words. The sun was warm on my shoulders, and I could taste salt in the air. I felt present in my body, in a way I hadn't in months, aware of my skin and my breathing, and the simple pleasure of existing in a beautiful place. When we finally packed up to leave, I didn't want the weekend to end. Driving back toward Clearwater, I felt like I was returning from a foreign country where I'd remembered a language I used to speak fluently. The language of possibility. The language of choice. Patricia hugged me goodbye in Marcus's driveway, and as her car pulled away, I stood looking at the guest house with its cheerful yellow paint and tiny windows. It looked exactly the same as when I'd left, but something fundamental had shifted in how I saw it. It wasn't my home. It was a place I had been staying while I forgot who I was. Marcus's car was in the garage, which meant he was home. I could see lights on in the kitchen and hear the distant sound of the boys playing video games. The world had continued without me, exactly as it should. I walked across the lawn to my little yellow sanctuary and sat down at the card table where I'd been managing someone else's life for 3 years. My laptop was still there, closed, waiting for me to log in and transfer money and pay bills and continue being useful in the way that had slowly erased me. Instead, I opened my phone and Googled Retirement Communities Sarasota, then Condos for Sale Clearwater Beach, then Part-Time Work Real Estate Florida. I was 68 years old. If I lived to 90, I had 22 years left. 22 years to write a different story about what it meant to age, to be a widow, to be a mother whose children were grown and capable of handling their own mortgages. 22 years to remember that I had forgotten to take pills I didn't need, and forgotten to pay a bill that wasn't mine, and in forgetting, I had remembered something much more important. I had remembered Margaret. Monday morning arrived with the sound of Marcus mowing the lawn at 7 a.m. The aggressive buzz of the riding mower circled my guest house like a mechanical alarm clock, ensuring I couldn't sleep past sunrise. This had become his new routine since I returned from Sarasota 3 days ago. Early morning lawn care, afternoon pool cleaning, evening hedge trimming. Tasks that had previously been done by a landscaping service were now being handled personally by my son, who seemed determined to demonstrate his presence in every corner of the property. I made coffee in my kitchenette and watched him through the small window above the sink. He wore noise-canceling headphones and mirror sunglasses, his jaw set in that particular way that meant he was thinking hard about something unpleasant. Each time he drove the mower past my little yellow house, he'd glance over without making eye contact, like he was checking to see if I was still there or if I might have disappeared during the night. The mortgage had been paid, of course. He'd handled it himself the day after I left for Sarasota, logging into his own account and discovering that managing his financial obligations wasn't actually rocket science. But something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be fixed with a simple bank transfer. He'd called me twice while I was gone, both times going straight to voicemail because I'd learned to silence my phone and only check messages when I felt like it. The first message was purely practical. "Mom, I paid the mortgage. We should probably talk when you get back about handling the bills going forward." The second, left late Sunday night, was different. His voice was quieter, less certain. "I've been thinking about what you said. Maybe we should sit down and figure some things out." But it was Monday now, and instead of sitting down to figure things out, he was mowing the lawn with the intensity of a man trying to solve complex problems through yard work. Jennifer emerged from the house carrying 2 travel mugs of coffee, wearing her usual Monday uniform of yoga pants, and an oversized sweater that probably cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. She handed 1 mug to Marcus, and they stood together near the pool discussing something I couldn't hear over the sound of the mower. Occasionally she'd gesture toward my guest house, her expression mixing concern with something that might have been irritation. I'd known Jennifer for 12 years, since she and Marcus started dating in college. She was a nice woman, the kind who remembered birthdays and organized charity events, and always brought beautifully wrapped hostess gifts to dinner parties. She worked part-time as an interior designer, specializing in what she called accessible luxury, making expensive things look effortless. Their house was a perfect example of her aesthetic. Everything cream and gray and carefully distressed. Nothing too new or too bold. Every surface designed to photograph well for her Instagram account where she documented their family's enviably curated life. When I first moved into the guest house, Jennifer had been genuinely welcoming. She'd stocked my little refrigerator with organic yogurt and expensive sparkling water, hung cheerful curtains in the windows, and assured me that I should think of their home as my home too. "We're so excited to have you close by," she'd said, and I believed she meant it. The problems started gradually, in ways so small they were almost invisible. It began with helpful suggestions. Maybe I'd be more comfortable if I knocked before coming into the main house, just so I wouldn't accidentally walk in during family time. Maybe I could use the side entrance instead of the front door, since the boys sometimes left toys in the foyer. Maybe I could do my laundry on Tuesdays and Fridays, when their cleaning lady wasn't using the machines. Each suggestion was perfectly reasonable, delivered with a smile and genuine concern for my comfort. But slowly, systematically, I was being trained to take up less space, make less noise, exist more quietly in the margins of their beautifully organized life. The financial arrangement had been Marcus's idea. "Mom, you're so good with numbers and organization. Would you mind helping me set up some automatic payments? I'm drowning in paperwork between work and the kids." It seemed natural enough. I'd been managing household finances for 40 years, and Marcus had always been more creative than practical. What started as helping him organize his filing system gradually expanded into managing most of their monthly obligations. I didn't mind the work initially. It gave me a sense of purpose, a way to contribute something valuable to their household. But somewhere in the process of paying their bills, I'd also started paying for their groceries, their landscaping, their housekeeping service. My own expenses had shrunk to almost nothing. Utilities for the guest house, my cell phone, occasionally buying my own coffee when I went out, which was rarely. I'd become financially invisible in my own life. My Social Security checks were deposited automatically into an account I barely touched. The substantial profit from selling my house sat in a savings account earning minimal interest while I lived like someone who couldn't afford basic necessities. I bought generic brands at the grocery store while paying for their organic produce. I wore clothes until they were worn out while Jennifer refreshed her wardrobe seasonally. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was managing the finances for a lifestyle I wasn't actually living. Marcus finished mowing and drove the tractor back to the shed, leaving Jennifer standing alone by the pool. She pulled out her phone and started taking photos of the freshly cut grass, probably for a post about Monday morning motivation or, quote, grateful for simple pleasures. I'd learned to recognize her content creation habits. The way she'd arrange the boys' backpacks and sports equipment for back-to-school posts. The careful placement of coffee cups and fresh flowers for lifestyle shots. The dozens of attempts to capture the perfect, candid family moment. I finished my coffee and decided to walk to the Publix about a mile away. I needed milk and bread, but mostly I needed to move my body and be somewhere that wasn't within sight of Marcus's anxious lawn maintenance. I'd been walking more since returning from Sarasota, trying to rebuild muscles and stamina that had atrophied during my 3 years of small living. The walk took me through a neighborhood of houses similar to Marcus's large, new constructions with perfect landscaping and 3-car garages. Most of the driveways were empty on Monday morning, the residents already at work or school or wherever people with busy, important lives spend their days. I passed a few dog walkers and joggers, people who nodded politely without interest, and I realized I'd become invisible here too. Just another older woman walking alone, unremarkable and easily overlooked. At Publix, I ran into Carol Hendricks, a woman I'd known peripherally when I was working in real estate. She'd been a mortgage broker, and we'd collaborated on several deals over the years. I hadn't seen her since Robert's funeral 3 years ago. "Margaret, how wonderful to see you. How have you been?" She looked genuinely pleased to encounter me, which felt strange after months of interactions with people who seemed to view me as a mildly burdensome obligation. "I've been fine," I said, realizing as the words left my mouth how automatic and empty they sounded. "Are you still selling houses? The market's been absolutely crazy lately. I keep thinking I should call you about some clients who are looking in Clearwater." The question caught me off guard. I'd been out of real estate for so long that I'd stopped thinking of myself as someone who had ever done that work. "Oh no, I retired a few years ago." "Retired?" Carol looked surprised. "But you were one of the best agents in the county, and you can't be more than what, 70? 68, I corrected. 68. "Margaret, people are starting real estate careers at 68 these days." My own mother got her license at 72 and sells condos to other retirees. She says it's the most fun she's ever had at a job. Carol leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, the older clients trust older agents more. They don't want some 25-year-old telling them about investment properties." We talked for a few more minutes about the market, about mutual acquaintances, about changes in the industry. Carol gave me her card and made me promise to call if I ever wanted to get back into sales, even part-time. "The good agents never really retire," she said. "They just take longer vacations." Walking home with my groceries, I found myself thinking about the woman I used to be when Carol and I worked together. That Margaret had worn tailored suits and carried a leather briefcase. She'd driven a clean car with real estate signs magnetized to the doors. She'd known the school ratings for every district in the county and could calculate mortgage payments in her head. She'd been confident, competent, someone other professionals respected and sought out for advice. That woman felt like a character from a book I'd read long ago. Familiar but distant. Back at the guest house, I found a note taped to my door. "Mom, Jennifer made extra lasagna. There's a plate in the fridge if you want it. M." The note was written on expensive stationery with Jennifer's monogram at the top. the kind of paper she used for thank you, notes and social correspondence. Even casual family communication had been elevated to match their aesthetic standards. I unstuck the note and held it, studying Marcus's handwriting, which looked exactly the same as when he was 8 years old and leaving me messages about lost homework and baseball practice. The lasagna was in a glass container with my name written on a piece of tape, sitting alone on the top shelf of my little refrigerator. It was still warm, which meant Jennifer had made the delivery while I was at the store. She'd let herself into my space with the spare key I'd given them for emergencies, another small boundary that had dissolved without discussion. I heated a portion and ate it at my card table while looking through the real estate section of the Tampa Bay Times. Houses were selling for prices that seemed impossible, modest 3-bedroom homes going for what luxury properties had cost when I was actively selling. The market had changed dramatically, but the fundamental appeal remained the same. People wanted spaces where they could build lives that reflected their dreams and values. I'd been good at understanding that desire, at translating abstract hopes into concrete features and locations. A young couple looking for their first home wasn't just buying bedrooms and bathrooms. They were buying a place to host holidays and raise children and become the people they wanted to be. Retirees downsizing weren't just looking for lower maintenance. They were looking for freedom, community, proximity to activities that would keep them engaged and vital. I wondered what I would tell a 68-year-old client who was living in her son's pool house, managing someone else's finances, and slowly disappearing from her own story. What kind of home would I recommend for someone who had forgotten what she actually wanted? That evening, Marcus knocked on my door around 8 o'clock. I was sitting in my one comfortable chair, reading a mystery novel I'd picked up at the Publix. Something light and entertaining that didn't require me to think too hard about deeper meanings or life lessons. "Can we talk?" he asked when I opened the door. I gestured for him to come in, though there wasn't much room for both of us in the small space. He sat on the edge of my bed while I returned to my chair, and for a moment we just looked at each other, two adults who shared DNA and history but had somehow become strangers. "I've been thinking about what you said before you left for Sarasota," he began, "about how I've been treating you." I waited for him to continue, but he seemed to be struggling with how to phrase whatever he'd come to say. "I don't want you to think I don't appreciate everything you've done for us. The bills, watching the boys, all the ways you've helped out. Jennifer and I both know we couldn't have managed without you." "But?" I prompted, because there was clearly a but coming. "But I've been worried about you. Not just the thing with the juice cups, but lots of little things. You seem different than you used to be. Quieter, less interested in things. I thought maybe you were getting depressed, or maybe there were some medical issues you weren't telling us about." I set my book aside and really looked at my son. He was 34 years old, successful in his career as a software developer, married to a woman who loved him, father to 2 healthy boys. By most measures, he was thriving. But sitting in my tiny guest house, trying to explain his concerns about my mental decline, he looked young and uncertain. "Marcus, can I ask you something? When was the last time you and I had a conversation about something I was interested in?" He blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean a conversation where you asked me about my thoughts, my opinions, my experiences. Not logistics about the boys' schedules or questions about whether I remembered to do something for your household. When did we last talk about books, or politics, or memories, or ideas?" He was quiet for a long moment, his face working through the question like a math problem he couldn't quite solve. "I can't remember," he admitted finally. "Neither can I. And that's not because my memory is failing, it's because those conversations stopped happening sometime after I moved into this guest house. I became the person who manages your bills and watches your children, and exists quietly in the background of your real life." Marcus shifted uncomfortably on the bed. "We never asked you to do those things. You offered." "You're right. I did offer. And you accepted, and then you began to expect, and then you began to assume I had nothing more interesting to do with my time. When I mixed up the juice cups, your first thought wasn't that I was distracted or thinking about something else. Your first thought was that I was becoming incompetent." "Mom, that's not..." "It is, though. And the really sad part is that I started to believe it too. I started to think maybe I was becoming someone who couldn't be trusted with simple tasks. Someone who needed to be managed and watched and possibly relocated to somewhere more appropriate for confused elderly people. I stood up and walked to the small window that looked out over their backyard. The pool lights were on, casting blue reflections on the water, and I could see into their kitchen where Jennifer was cleaning up after dinner, moving efficiently through a routine she'd perfected. I had lunch with Patricia's neighbor Dorothy while I was in Sarasota. She's 81 years old and just got her pilot's license. Can you imagine me telling Dorothy that she forgot to take her pills because she put orange juice in the wrong cup? Marcus was quiet behind me. I also met a woman named Marie who started painting at 75 and now has her work in galleries, and a couple who sold their house and bought an RV to drive to Alaska. These are people who decided that aging meant expanding their lives, not contracting them. I turned back to face him. I'm not declining, Marcus. I'm not becoming incompetent or confused or unable to manage basic tasks. I'm becoming smaller because I've been living a smaller life. There's a difference. He rubbed his hands over his face, looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. So what do you want? What would make this better? It was a fair question, and I realized I didn't have a complete answer yet. I knew what I didn't want. I didn't want to continue being the invisible support system for someone else's life. But what I did want was still taking shape, still emerging from the weekend in Sarasota where I'd remembered who I used to be. I want to stop managing your finances, I said. Not because I'm angry, but because it's not my job. You're a grown man with a good job and a college education. You can pay your own mortgage. Marcus nodded slowly. I want to stop being the automatic babysitter for the boys. I love spending time with them, but I want it to be because we're choosing to spend time together, not because someone needs free childcare. Another nod. And I want to stop living in this guest house. It was supposed to be temporary, and it's been 3 years. I need my own space, my own life, my own reasons to get up in the morning. This time, Marcus looked genuinely surprised. You want to move out? I want to move forward. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I know it doesn't look like this. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing what had been said. Outside, I could hear the automatic sprinkler system starting up, sending arcs of water across the lawn Marcus had mowed that morning with such determined intensity. Will you stay until we figure out childcare? He asked finally. Jennifer's got several big projects coming up, and we hadn't planned. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised from a baby who couldn't sleep through the night, who'd been afraid of thunderstorms until he was 10, who'd called me crying from college when his first girlfriend broke up with him. I loved him completely, but I also realized that love didn't require me to sacrifice my own life to make his more convenient. I'll help you transition, I said. But Marcus, I need you to understand something. I'm not declining. I'm just done being invisible. After he left, I sat in my chair and finished the mystery novel. The detective solved the case through careful observation and logical deduction, skills that hadn't deteriorated with age but had actually improved through experience. The killer was caught, justice was served, and everyone moved forward into whatever came next. I closed the book and looked around my little yellow room with its small windows and cramped quarters. Tomorrow, I would start looking at apartments. Not assisted living facilities or senior communities, just regular apartments where regular people lived regular lives. Places with full-sized kitchens and rooms large enough for actual furniture and windows that let in enough light to read by. Places where I could remember that being 68 didn't mean being finished. I turned off the lamp and settled into my narrow bed, listening to the familiar sounds of Marcus's household settling down for the night. The dishwasher running, the boys brushing their teeth, Jennifer checking the locks on the doors. The routine would continue without me, exactly as it should. And for the first time in 3 years, that thought didn't make me feel sad. It made me feel free. The apartment viewing was scheduled for Thursday at 2 o'clock, but I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in my car across the street, studying the building like I was preparing for an exam. It was a modest complex in downtown St. Petersburg, nothing fancy but clean and well-maintained, with balconies that overlooked Tampa Bay and parking spaces that didn't require asking permission to use. I'd found the listing online Tuesday morning while Marcus was at work and Jennifer was at her yoga class. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, updated kitchen, walking distance to the pier and the Saturday market. The rent was $800 a month, which seemed reasonable until I realized I'd been living essentially rent-free for 3 years, and had forgotten what it felt like to pay for my own space. The leasing agent was a woman about my age named Rosa, who wore comfortable shoes and spoke with the confidence of someone who'd been showing apartments for decades. She didn't seem surprised to meet a potential tenant in her late 60s, didn't ask probing questions about my income or living situation, didn't treat me like someone who needed special accommodations or careful handling. The previous tenant lived here for 12 years, Rosa told me as we walked through the small but bright space. She only moved because her granddaughter had a baby in Orlando, and she wanted to be closer. Otherwise, she'd probably still be here. The apartment had good light, hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly when you walked across them, and a kitchen with enough counter space to actually cook real meals. The bedroom was large enough for a proper bed and a dresser, and the living room had space for a couch, a bookshelf, maybe even a small desk by the window where I could sit and write without feeling like I was hiding. The balcony was what sold me. It faced west toward the water, and even in the afternoon I could see sailboats moving slowly across the bay. Rosa mentioned that the sunsets were spectacular from this angle, that the previous tenant used to host little gatherings where neighbors would come watch the sky change colors while sharing wine and conversation. When could I move in? I asked, surprising myself with the directness of the question. First of the month if you want it, Rosa said. I'll need first month's rent, security deposit, and we can do the paperwork today if you're ready. I wasn't ready. I hadn't told Marcus and Jennifer about my apartment hunting. I hadn't figured out how to extract myself from managing their household logistics. I hadn't even decided definitively that I was really going to do this rather than just thinking about doing it. But standing on that balcony, looking out at the water where boats moved freely in whatever direction their captains chose, I heard myself saying, I'll take it. Rosa smiled like she'd expected this response. Good choice. Mrs. Patterson is going to be very happy to know someone who appreciates the view we'll be living here. We went back inside to handle the paperwork, and I wrote a check for the deposits while trying not to think too hard about what I was committing to. The lease was for 1 year, renewable at my option. 12 months to figure out what came next, to remember how to live alone, to rebuild a life that was entirely my own. Driving back to Clearwater, I felt like I was carrying a secret that might explode if I held it too tightly. I'd committed to a lease without consulting anyone, made a major life decision based purely on my own preferences and needs. It felt reckless and responsible at the same time, like learning to ride a bicycle all over again at 68. Marcus's car was in the driveway when I got home, which was unusual for a Thursday afternoon. I found him in the kitchen, making coffee, still wearing his work clothes but looking like someone who'd left the office early, for reasons that had nothing to do with leisure. Mom, we need to talk, he said, before I'd even set down my purse. I poured myself coffee and sat at their kitchen island, noting how different it felt to be here now that I knew I'd be leaving. The granite countertops, the stainless steel appliances, the carefully arranged fresh flowers that Jennifer replaced every Monday. It all looked like a magazine spread for a life I'd never quite fit into. Jennifer got a call today from the boys' school, Marcus continued. Apparently Tyler told his teacher that Grandma was moving away and wouldn't be able to pick him up anymore. The teacher called to confirm pickup arrangements, and Jennifer had no idea what Tyler was talking about. My heart sank. I hadn't told the boys about my apartment plans, but children have a way of sensing changes in the adults around them, picking up on conversations they're not supposed to hear, and tensions they can't quite name. Jennifer's pretty upset, Marcus went on. She's been counting on you being available for backup childcare, especially with the busy season coming up for her design work. She's got 3 major projects starting next month. I sipped my coffee and tried to organize my thoughts. I'd signed a lease 2 hours ago, which meant this conversation was no longer theoretical. But I also hadn't intended for Jennifer to find out through a confused phone call from an elementary school teacher. I was planning to talk to both of you this weekend, I said. I wanted to give you time to make other arrangements. So it's true? You're really moving out? I found an apartment in St. Petersburg. I can move in next month. Marcus sat down across from me, his expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been panic. "Mom, this seems really sudden. Is this about the mortgage thing? Because I thought we worked that out." "It's not about the mortgage. It's about me needing my own life. But you have a life here. You're part of our family." I looked around their beautiful kitchen, at the family photos covering the refrigerator, at the boys' artwork held up with colorful magnets. In all those pictures, in all that evidence of their happy family life, I appeared in exactly 3 photos. Background figures from holiday gatherings, where I'd been the designated photographer. "Marcus, when you picture your family, who do you see?" "What do you mean?" "Close your eyes and picture your family. Who's in that image?" He looked at me like this was a trick question, but he closed his eyes anyway. "You, me, Jennifer, Tyler, and Connor. Now picture your family having dinner together on a typical Tuesday night. Where's everyone sitting?" "Around the dining room table. Jennifer and I at each end, the boys on the sides." He opened his eyes, and I could see the moment he realized what was missing from his mental picture. "Where do I sit during family dinners, Marcus?" "You usually eat earlier, in the guest house. You said you preferred eating alone." "I said that because there wasn't room at your table for a 5th person, and it seemed easier to remove myself than to point out that I was being excluded." The silence that followed was thick with recognition. Marcus stared down at his coffee mug, and I could see him mentally reviewing years of family dinners, birthday celebrations, holiday gatherings where I'd been present but peripheral, helpful but not included. "We never meant to make you feel left out," he said quietly. "I know you didn't. That's what makes this so complicated. You're not bad people, and this isn't a bad situation. But it's not sustainable for me anymore." Jennifer came home while we were still sitting in the kitchen, her yoga mat rolled under her arm, and her hair pulled back in the kind of effortless ponytail that probably took 15 minutes to achieve. She looked between Marcus and me, immediately sensing the weight of whatever conversation we'd been having. "Did you tell her about the school calling?" she asked Marcus. "She told me about the apartment," he replied. Jennifer sat down, her yoga mat, and joined us at the kitchen island, her face shifting into the expression she wore when dealing with problems that required careful management. "Margaret, I have to say I'm surprised by this. I thought you were happy here. You never mentioned wanting to move." "I never mentioned a lot of things I wanted," I said. "I've been very good at accommodating everyone else's needs, and very bad at expressing my own. But this seems so impulsive. Wouldn't it make more sense to wait until after the holidays? Or maybe look into some of those nice senior communities, where you'd have people your own age?" There it was. The assumption that my age determined what kind of life I should want, what kind of housing I should find appropriate, what kind of community I should seek out. Jennifer meant well, but she was treating me like a problem to be solved rather than a person making a choice. "I'm not looking for people my own age," I said. "I'm looking for my own space. Age has nothing to do with it." Jennifer glanced at Marcus, one of those quick spousal communications that excluded me even while I was sitting right there. "It's just that we've gotten so used to having you here," she continued. "The boys adore you, and you're such a help with everything. I don't know how we'll manage without you. You'll figure it out. People managed their own households and childcare for thousands of years before grandmothers moved into guest houses." "Mom," Marcus said, "what if we made some changes? What if we gave you more space in the main house? Or what if we converted the garage into a bigger apartment for you?" "You're missing the point," I said. "I don't want a bigger space in your house. I want my own house." The boys came home from school while we were still circling around the central issue, their backpacks hitting the floor with that particular thud of Thursday afternoon exhaustion. Tyler went straight to the refrigerator while Connor flopped dramatically onto the living room couch, both of them performing the ritual of transitioning from school mode to home mode. "Hey, Grandma," Tyler called over his shoulder while examining leftover pizza. "Are you really moving away?" "I'm moving to my own apartment," I said, "but I'm not moving far away. I'll still see you all the time." "Will you still watch us when Mom has to work late?" Connor asked from the couch. I looked at Jennifer, then at Marcus, both of them clearly hoping I'd say yes, that I'd promise to continue being their backup childcare plan, even while living 20 minutes away. "Sometimes," I said, "when I can." But your parents will need to make other arrangements for most of the time. Tyler closed the refrigerator and looked at me with the serious expression 8-year-olds wear when they're trying to understand adult decisions that don't make sense to them. Why do you want to live by yourself? Don't you like living with us? It was an honest question that deserved an honest answer, even if that answer was complicated for a child to understand. I do like living near you, I said. But sometimes grown-ups need their own space to remember who they are when they're not taking care of other people. Like when I need alone time in my room? Connor asked. Exactly like that. Everyone needs alone time sometimes, even grandmas. The boys seemed to accept this explanation more easily than their parents had. They knew about needing space, about wanting privacy, about the difference between being lonely and being alone. Children understood these things instinctively before adults taught them that independence was selfish. That evening, after the boys had finished their homework and Jennifer had retreated to her home office to work on client presentations, Marcus came back to the guest house. I was packing books into boxes I'd picked up from the UPS store, trying to decide which volumes had earned the right to come with me to my new life and which ones could be donated to the library. This is really happening, he said, watching me wrap my favorite coffee mug in newspaper. It really is. I keep thinking there's something I should say, some way to convince you to stay. I looked up from my packing. Marcus, do you remember when you moved out for college? Of course. Did you want me to convince you to stay home? No, but that was different. I was 18. I was supposed to leave. And I'm 68. When exactly am I supposed to start living my own life again? He didn't have an answer for that, because the truth was that he'd never considered I might want to start over, might have dreams and plans that didn't center around his family's needs. In his mind, I'd reached the age where people wind down, settle in, accept whatever comfortable arrangement was offered, and be grateful for it. I'm scared, he admitted. What if something happens to you? What if you get sick or hurt, and we don't know? The same thing that happens to millions of people who live alone. I'll call 911, or I'll call you, or I'll figure it out. Marcus, I lived independently for 40 years before your father died. I think I remember how it works. But you're older now. I'm older, not incapacitated. There's a difference. I continued packing while he sat on my bed, both of us working through the reality that our relationship was about to change in ways neither of us had anticipated. For 3 years, we'd existed in a comfortable arrangement where I provided services and he provided housing, where my presence solved his problems and his family gave me purpose. Now I was opting out of that arrangement, and we both had to figure out how to be mother and son without the familiar structure of usefulness and need. Will you still help with the boys sometimes? He asked. When you ask nicely and give me advance notice, yes, but I won't be your automatic backup plan anymore. And the bills? You can set up automatic payments online. Most banks offer the service for free. What about holidays? I stopped packing and looked at him directly. What about them? Will you still come for Christmas and Thanksgiving and birthdays? Do you want me to? Of course I do. Then ask me. Invite me. Include me in the planning instead of assuming I'll show up and handle the logistics while you and Jennifer host the actual celebration. Marcus rubbed his face with his hands, looking overwhelmed by the number of changes he was going to have to navigate. I never realized we were treating you like hired help, he said. You weren't treating me like hired help. You were treating me like someone who didn't have anything better to do with her time, which, for the past 3 years, was pretty much accurate. And now you do? Have something better to do? I sealed up the box of books and labeled it with a black marker. I don't know yet. That's what I'm moving out to discover. 2 weeks later, Patricia drove down from Sarasota to help me move. She arrived in a rental truck despite my protests that I didn't have enough belongings to require professional moving equipment, but she insisted that moving deserved ceremony, proper logistics, and at least one person who was completely supportive of the decision. Moving is always an act of faith, she said as we loaded boxes into the truck. You're betting on a future version of yourself that doesn't exist yet. Marcus and Jennifer helped carry my furniture, which amounted to very little. The card table that had served as my desk, the single comfortable chair I'd bought for the guest house, a small bookshelf, and my clothes. Everything else either belonged to their household or stayed behind because it didn't fit the life I was imagining for myself. The boys rode with us to St. Petersburg, chattering excitedly about Grandma's new apartment and asking if they could have sleepovers there. Jennifer followed in her car, her expression neutral but tense, like someone attending a funeral for a person who wasn't actually dead. The apartment looked different with my belongings in it, smaller, but also more promising. Patricia had brought a bottle of champagne and insisted we christen the space properly, toasting to new beginnings and second chances, and the courage to change course at any age. "To Margaret," she said, raising her glass while we stood on my new balcony watching the afternoon light dance on Tampa Bay, who forgot to pay the mortgage and remembered how to pay attention to her own life. Marcus and Jennifer left before sunset, taking the boys with them and promising to call soon to check on how I was settling in. They looked uncertain, like people who'd just dropped off an elderly relative at an institution and weren't sure they'd made the right choice. Patricia stayed for dinner, helping me unpack my kitchen supplies and set up my small table by the window where I could eat while watching the water. We ordered pizza from a place down the street and ate it off paper plates while sitting on my floor, talking about practical things, like where to find a good grocery store and which neighbors might be worth getting to know. "How does it feel?" she asked as the sun began to set, painting my new living room in shades of gold and pink. I considered the question while looking around at boxes that still needed unpacking, at walls that were bare but full of potential, at windows that let in light that belonged to me alone. "Terrifying," I said, "and wonderful, and like something I should have done 2 years ago." "Most good decisions feel that way," Patricia said. "If you're not a little scared, you're probably not growing." After she left, I stood on my balcony watching the last of the sunset fade into purple twilight. Boats were heading back to harbor, their lights beginning to twinkle against the darkening water. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear music drifting from a waterfront restaurant, the kind of live acoustic guitar that makes ordinary Thursday nights feel special. I was alone in my own space for the first time in 3 years. No one knew exactly where I was or what I was doing. No one needed me to be anywhere or handle anything or remember to take pills I wasn't actually prescribed. I could eat dinner at whatever time I chose, or not eat dinner at all. I could stay up late reading or go to bed early. I could play music or sit in silence. I could rearrange my furniture or leave boxes unpacked for weeks. The freedom was dizzying. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at my small table, looking out at the lights beginning to appear in windows across the bay. Tomorrow I would start figuring out what came next. Whether I wanted to look for part-time work, or volunteer somewhere, or simply spend time rediscovering what I enjoyed doing when no one else's schedule determined my days. Tonight I was content to sit in my own space, drinking tea from my own mug, watching a sunset that no one had asked me to appreciate on their behalf. I'd forgotten to pay the mortgage, and in doing so I'd remembered how to pay attention to my own life. It was, I realized, the best financial decision I'd made in years. The first morning in my new apartment, I woke up at 5:30 because I'd forgotten to buy curtains, and the sunrise was streaming directly across my face. Instead of feeling annoyed, I lay in bed watching the light change from deep orange to pale yellow, listening to the sounds of a neighborhood I didn't yet know. A jogger's footsteps on the sidewalk below, a dog barking somewhere in the distance, the gentle splash of waves against the seawall that ran along the bay. I made coffee in my new kitchen, still marveling at the fact that I could use any mug I wanted without worrying about whether someone else might need it. I chose my favorite, the one with the slightly chipped handle that I'd rescued from the donation box 3 times over the years because it fit perfectly in my hands. Standing at my kitchen window, I could see the marina where fishing boats were already heading out for the day, their captains probably following routines they'd perfected over decades. There was something profound about having no obligations on a Friday morning. No one expected me to be anywhere or do anything. No laundry waited in someone else's machine. No bills sat on someone else's counter requiring my attention. No children needed breakfast or lunch money or permission slips signed. For the first time in years, my day belonged entirely to me. I spent the morning unpacking boxes with deliberate slowness, taking time to decide where each item should live in this new space. My books went on the shelf by the window, where the light was best for reading. My few pieces of jewelry went in the top drawer of the dresser, no longer hidden away because there was nowhere special to wear them. My photo of Robert and me on our anniversary trip to Key West found a place on the side table where I'd see it every day without it dominating the room. Around noon, I decided to explore the neighborhood. I walked down Central Avenue, past art galleries and coffee shops and a bookstore with a hand-painted sign that advertised poetry readings on Wednesday nights. The sidewalks were wide and tree-lined, with benches positioned to take advantage of shade and views. I passed other people walking alone, some with dogs, some with books, some simply moving through the world at their own pace without explanation or destination. At a cafe called The Mandolin, I ordered a sandwich and sat at a table outside where I could watch pedestrians and practice the art of being alone in public without feeling self-conscious. The waitress was a woman about my age with silver hair pulled back in a colorful scarf and paint under her fingernails. When she brought my order, she lingered for a moment. "I haven't seen you before. Are you new to the neighborhood?" "I just moved into the Bayfront apartments," I said, still figuring everything out. "Oh, you'll love it there. Great view, and you're walking distance to everything worth doing downtown." "I'm Carmen, by the way. I work here most days, and I live about 6 blocks over." "Margaret. And thank you for the recommendation about location. I think I'm going to like it here. Are you retired or still working?" It was a simple question, but I realized I didn't have a simple answer. I wasn't working, but I didn't feel retired in the way people usually meant the word. Retired implied finishing something, completing a career, moving into a phase of life focused on leisure and maintenance. But sitting at that cafe table, I felt more like I was beginning something rather than ending it. "I'm figuring that out too," I said. Carmen smiled like she understood exactly what I meant. "Well, when you do figure it out, let me know. I'm always curious about people who have the courage to start over." After lunch, I walked to the pier that stretched out into Tampa Bay. Fishermen lined the railings with their tackle boxes and coolers, some chatting with each other, others focused silently on their lines. I found an empty bench about halfway out and sat watching pelicans dive for fish while tourists took selfies against the backdrop of the water. An elderly man at the next bench was reading a thick paperback novel, occasionally looking up to check his fishing rod. After a while, he caught me glancing at his book and held it up so I could see the cover. "Ever read any Carl Hiaasen?" he asked. "No, but I've heard good things. Florida crime writer. Funny as hell and probably more accurate about this state than any history book you'll find." He introduced himself as Frank and explained that he came to the pier most afternoons, not so much for the fishing as for the combination of sun, salt air, and uninterrupted reading time. "My wife thinks I'm out here catching our dinner," he said. "But mostly I'm catching up on books I never had time to read when I was working." We talked for almost an hour about books, about the peculiarities of Florida, about the pleasure of having nowhere urgent to be. Frank had been a high school principal for 35 years and had retired 2 years ago when his wife suggested they move from Ohio to St. Petersburg. "Best decision we ever made," he said. "Not just the weather, though that's nice, it's the pace. People down here understand that life doesn't have to be a race." When I finally walked back to my apartment, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades I'd forgotten to notice during my years in the guest house. I stopped at a grocery store and bought ingredients for a real dinner. Fresh fish, vegetables I actually wanted to eat, a bottle of wine that cost more than I'd spent on alcohol in months. Cooking in my own kitchen felt like a meditation. I moved slowly, tasting as I went, adjusting seasonings according to my own preferences rather than accommodating someone else's dietary restrictions or favorite flavors. I set my small table with real napkins and lit a candle, not because anyone was coming to dinner, but because I deserved the ceremony of a properly prepared meal. While eating, I called Patricia to report on my first day of independence. "How does it feel to be a woman of leisure?" she asked. "Strange. Good. A little overwhelming. I keep waiting for someone to need something from me. That'll pass. Pretty soon you'll forget what it felt like to live on someone else's schedule." I told her about Carmen at the cafe and Frank on the pier, how surprisingly easy it had been to have conversations with strangers when I wasn't rushing somewhere else or thinking about tasks waiting for me at home. "That's the thing about moving to a new place," Patricia said. You get to decide who you are instead of being who people expect you to be. After we hung up, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine, watching boats navigate the channel that led out to the Gulf of Mexico. The evening was warm but not humid, with a breeze that carried the scent of salt and something else. Maybe jasmine from someone's garden, or the lingering fragrance of dinner being cooked in a dozen different kitchens. I thought about Marcus and Jennifer, probably finishing their own dinner right about now, dealing with homework and bath time and the evening routines that had once included me. I wondered if they were struggling with the logistics I used to handle, or if they'd already adapted to managing their household without my invisible assistance. I felt a pang of something. Not regret exactly, but a kind of tender sadness for the version of myself who had been so eager to be useful that she'd forgotten to be visible. That woman had meant well, had genuinely wanted to help, but she'd also been afraid. Afraid of being alone, afraid of being unnecessary, afraid of discovering that without other people's needs to fulfill, she might not know who she was. Sitting on my own balcony, drinking my own wine, watching my own sunset, I was beginning to suspect that woman had been wrong about almost everything. Saturday morning brought rain, the kind of gentle, persistent Florida shower that makes everything green and washes the humidity out of the air. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, listening to the drops against my windows while reading the St. Petersburg Times I'd picked up from the lobby. There was something luxurious about reading an entire newspaper without interruption, following stories from beginning to end, forming opinions about local politics and community events without having to explain or defend them to anyone else. In the arts section, I found an advertisement for a volunteer orientation at the Museum of Fine Arts. They needed docents to give tours, help with educational programs, and assist with special events. The training started the following week, and applicants were encouraged to come with enthusiasm for art and willingness to learn, rather than formal education in art history. I tore out the ad and put it on my refrigerator, not as a commitment but as a possibility. For 3 years, I'd had no schedule other than other people's emergencies. The idea of having somewhere to be by choice, of learning something new just because it interested me, felt almost revolutionary. Sunday, I decided to drive back to Clearwater to see the boys. I'd promised Tyler and Connor that moving to my own apartment didn't mean disappearing from their lives, and I wanted to keep that promise while also establishing new boundaries about how and when I spent time with Marcus's family. I called first, which felt strange but necessary. Jennifer answered and seemed surprised to hear from me, as if she'd expected me to simply show up unannounced the way I had for 3 years. "Of course you can see the boys," she said. "We're just hanging around the house today. Marcus is cleaning the pool, and the kids are playing video games. Would it be all right if I took them out for lunch? Maybe to that place near the beach they like?" There was a pause, and I could hear Jennifer processing this request. Taking the boys somewhere meant making plans, coordinating schedules, being responsible for their care outside the controlled environment of their home. For 3 years, my time with them had been confined to their house, their rules, their oversight. "I suppose that would be fine," she said finally. "What time should we expect you back?" "How about 3 o'clock? Another pause. "3 is fine. Should I pack snacks? Or maybe you could just stay here and we could order pizza." I understood what was happening. Jennifer was trying to contain this outing, to keep it familiar and manageable rather than allowing me to establish new traditions with my grandsons that didn't include her direct supervision. "I think we'll be fine with just lunch," I said. "But I'll have my phone if you need to reach us." When I arrived at Marcus's house, both boys ran out to greet me before I'd even parked my car. They climbed into my back seat, chattering about school and friends and a movie they wanted to see, their excitement pure and uncomplicated in the way only children can manage. "Grandma, do you like living by yourself?" Connor asked as we drove toward the restaurant. "I do. It's different, but I like it." "Are you lonely?" Quote, Tyler wanted to know. "Sometimes. But being lonely and being alone aren't the same thing. I can be alone and still feel happy. Like when I play in my room by myself," Connor said. Exactly like that. At lunch, they told me about their week, about a science project Tyler was working on and a new friend Connor had made at recess. They asked about my apartment. whether I had a pool, whether they could sleep over sometime. Their questions were direct and practical, focused on the logistics of our changing relationship, rather than the emotional complexity that had their parents so unsettled. "Can we come visit next weekend?" Tyler asked while demolishing a cheeseburger. "If your parents say it's okay, I'd love to have you visit. Will you still help with our homework when we come see you?" "If you want me to, but I won't be available to help every day the way I used to be." Connor considered this while stealing French fries from his brother's plate. "That's okay. Dad can help us with math. He's actually pretty good at it." Driving them home, I realized something had shifted in how they saw me. For 3 years, I'd been grandma who lives in the back house, available for babysitting and homework help and whatever small emergencies arose. Now I was grandma who has her own place, someone they visited rather than someone who simply existed in the margins of their daily life. It was a healthier dynamic, I thought. More intentional, more special, less taken for granted. Marcus was waiting in the driveway when we returned, his expression carefully neutral in the way people look when they're trying not to reveal anxiety. "How was lunch?" he asked the boys. "Good. Grandma says we can visit her apartment if you say it's okay," Tyler announced. "We'll see," Marcus said, which both boys correctly interpreted as, "Probably yes, but I need to discuss it with your mother first." After the boys ran inside, Marcus and I stood by my car having the kind of awkward conversation adults have when familiar relationships are being renegotiated. "They seem fine," he observed. "They are fine. Children are more adaptable than adults give them credit for." Jennifer was worried about them being upset by the change. I studied my son's face, noting the lines of stress around his eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago. "Marcus, are you and Jennifer okay? This whole transition seems to be harder on you than it is on them." He shrugged, but I could see the weight of whatever he was carrying. "It's just different. We're having to figure out a lot of things we used to take for granted. Childcare, scheduling, managing the household. I didn't realize how much we depended on you being available." "Is that a bad thing? Learning to manage your own household?" "No, it's just harder than I expected." I felt a familiar tug, the old instinct to offer solutions, to step back into the role of fixer and smoother over of difficulties. But I also recognized that this was exactly the kind of discomfort that led to growth, the necessary awkwardness of learning new skills and taking responsibility for choices and consequences. "You'll figure it out," I said. "And if you need specific help with something, you can ask me. But I won't be your automatic backup plan anymore." Driving back to St. Petersburg, I felt the difference between visiting Marcus's house and going home to my own space. The relief of returning to a place where I could take off my shoes and put on comfortable clothes without asking permission, where I could eat dinner at whatever time I chose, where I could spend the evening reading or watching television, or simply sitting quietly without having to consider anyone else's preferences. Monday morning, I called the Museum of Fine Arts and signed up for the docent training. The woman who took my information sounded genuinely pleased to hear from me, especially when I mentioned my background in real estate. "We love having people with experience talking to the public," she said. "And honestly, we need volunteers who can commit to regular schedules. So many people start enthusiastically and then fade away when they realize it's actual work." The training would be 2 days a week for 6 weeks, followed by shadowing experienced docents before beginning to give tours independently. It wasn't paid work, but it was purposeful work, something that would give structure to my days while contributing to something larger than my own comfort. Tuesday evening, I attended my first poetry reading at the bookstore I discovered on Central Avenue. I almost didn't go, intimidated by the prospect of sitting alone in a room full of strangers listening to art I might not understand. But I forced myself to walk the 3 blocks from my apartment, telling myself I could always leave if I felt out of place. The bookstore was crowded with people of all ages, some sitting on folding chairs, others standing along the walls or sitting on the floor near the front. The readers were local poets, some polished and confident, others clearly nervous but brave enough to share their work anyway. The poems covered everything from love and loss to social justice, and the peculiar beauty of Florida wildlife. During the intermission, a woman sitting next to me introduced herself as Elena and asked if I was a regular at these events. First time, I admitted. I'm still figuring out what's available in the neighborhood. These readings are wonderful, Elena said. Very supportive community. Half the people here write poetry themselves, so everyone understands how vulnerable it feels to share your work. Do you write? A little. Mostly, I come for the listening. There's something about hearing poems read aloud that you can't get from reading them on the page. After the reading, several people lingered to talk about the poems, to introduce newcomers, to make plans for next week's event. I found myself in conversation with a retired teacher, a young man who worked at the marina, and a woman who painted watercolors of local birds. They were curious about me without being intrusive, welcoming without being overwhelming. Walking home under the streetlights, I realized I'd spent 3 hours in the company of strangers and enjoyed every minute of it. Not because I'd been useful or needed, but simply because I'd been present, engaged, open to experiencing something new. Wednesday morning brought my first docent training session at the museum. I arrived early, nervous about whether I'd be able to keep up with whatever was expected of me, whether my brain had atrophied too much during my years of small living to absorb new information effectively. The other trainees ranged in age from college students to people in their 80s, all of us gathered in a classroom facing a reproduction of a painting I didn't recognize. Our instructor, Dr. Sarah Martinez, had the kind of energy that made learning feel like adventure rather than obligation. The goal isn't to become art historians, she told us. The goal is to become storytellers. Every painting, every sculpture, every piece in our collection has stories to tell about the artist, about the time period, about the techniques used, about the emotions expressed. Your job will be to help visitors discover those stories. We spent 2 hours learning about the museum's collection, practicing observation techniques, discussing how to engage visitors of different ages and backgrounds. I found myself taking notes eagerly, asking questions, participating in discussions with an enthusiasm I hadn't felt since my early days in real estate, when every new listing taught me something about architecture, neighborhood history, or the dreams people carried when looking for homes. During the break, I struck up a conversation with another trainee, a man named David, who'd recently retired from a career in banking. I never thought I'd be interested in art, he confessed. But my wife dragged me to an exhibition last month, and I found myself actually enjoying it. Figured I might as well learn something instead of just pretending to appreciate it. What kind of exhibition? Local artists. Paintings of Florida landscapes. But not the touristy stuff. Real Florida, swamps and scrubland, and the kind of light you only get in the late afternoon when the humidity makes everything look like it's underwater. I knew exactly what he meant. I'd been noticing that light myself lately, the way late-day sun transformed ordinary scenes into something magical. Living alone, paying attention to my own rhythm rather than someone else's schedule, I'd become more aware of small changes in weather and light and season. I think I'm going to like this more than I expected, I told David. Me too, he said. My wife keeps asking what I'm getting out of it, since it's volunteer work. But I think that getting something out of it is the point. Thursday afternoon, I had my first real conversation with my neighbor across the hall. I'd seen her coming and going, a woman about my age who always carried a canvas bag full of art supplies, but we'd only exchanged polite hellos in the hallway. I was struggling to carry groceries and unlock my door simultaneously when she appeared with her own armload of packages. Here, let me help you with that, she said, holding my bags while I fumbled with the key. Thank you. I'm Margaret, by the way. I moved in last week. Helen. I've been here about 2 years. Welcome to the building. She followed me inside to help set the groceries on my kitchen counter, and I could see her taking in my still sparse apartment with the eye of someone who understood spatial design. Great light in here, she said, looking toward my balcony, and that view of the water never gets old. Are you an artist? I asked, gesturing toward her supply bag. Trying to be. I started painting when I moved here, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for. Turns out I'm not terrible at it. Helen invited me to see some of her work, and I followed her across the hall to an apartment identical to mine in layout, but completely different in feeling. Her walls were covered with watercolors and oils, landscapes, seascapes, street scenes from downtown St. Petersburg. They weren't gallery-quality masterpieces, but they were confident, joyful, full of the kind of light and color that made ordinary subjects look worth celebrating. "These are wonderful," I said, meaning it. "How long have you been painting?" 2 years. I took a class at the community center when I first moved here, partly to meet people and partly because I was tired of being the kind of person who said she'd always wanted to try painting but never actually tried it. We sat on her balcony drinking iced tea while she told me about her art classes, about the group of women she painted with every Saturday morning at Vinoy Park, about the small gallery downtown that had agreed to display some of her work. "The funny thing is," Helen said, "I spent my whole career as an accountant, convinced I didn't have a creative bone in my body. Turns out I just never had time to find out what was possible." When I told her about the docent training, about the poetry readings, about slowly rebuilding a life that was entirely my own choice, she nodded with the understanding of someone who'd made similar discoveries. "It's amazing what you can learn about yourself when you stop being busy with other people's priorities," she said. That evening, I called Marcus to confirm plans for the boys to visit me the following weekend. Jennifer answered the phone, and I could hear the careful neutrality in her voice that meant she was still adjusting to the new dynamics of our relationship. "They're very excited about seeing your apartment," she said. "Tyler's been talking about it all week. I'm looking forward to it too. I thought we might walk down to the pier, maybe visit the Children's Museum if they're interested." "That sounds nice. Should I pack anything special? Snacks or extra clothes or—" I recognized the subtext. Jennifer was trying to maintain some control over the boys' experience with me, to ensure that even when they were in my care, they were still operating according to her standards and preferences. "I think we'll be fine," I said. "But I'll call if we need anything." Friday night, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine, watching the lights of boats moving across the bay while reflecting on my first 2 weeks of independence. I'd signed up for activities, met new people, had conversations about art and poetry, and the peculiar pleasure of learning new skills in your 60s. I'd taken my grandsons to lunch, without asking permission for every decision. I'd eaten dinner alone without feeling lonely, and woken up each morning with nowhere to be except where I chose to go. Most surprisingly, I'd stopped checking my phone constantly, stopped feeling anxious about whether Marcus and Jennifer needed help with something, stopped defining my worth by how useful I could be to other people's lives. I was becoming someone I'd forgotten I could be, a woman with her own interests, her own schedule, her own reasons for getting up in the morning that had nothing to do with solving other people's problems. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden, it was happening in small increments, one choice at a time, one conversation at a time, one morning at a time when I woke up and remembered that the day ahead belonged entirely to me. Sitting there under the stars, listening to the gentle sound of water against the seawall, I realized I was no longer the woman who'd forgotten to take pills she didn't need and forgotten to pay a mortgage that wasn't hers. I was the woman who'd remembered how to forget about everyone else's expectations long enough to remember what she actually wanted from the life she still had left to live. 6 months later, I stood in the Museum of Fine Arts lobby wearing my docent badge and comfortable shoes, watching a group of third graders marvel at a bronze sculpture they insisted looked like their playground monkey bars. Their teacher was struggling to maintain order while I waited nearby, no longer nervous about leading tours but genuinely excited about sharing stories that might spark curiosity in young minds. "Mrs. Chen," called out a boy with paint-stained fingers, "why did the artist make the lady's face look so sad?" I knelt down to his eye level, something I'd learned from Helen, who volunteered at the children's art classes on Saturdays. "What do you think? Sometimes artists put feelings into their work that they can't say with words." The boy studied the sculpture seriously, then announced, "Maybe she lost her dog." His classmates erupted with their own theories. Lost homework, broken toys, having to eat vegetables, while I guided them toward the next gallery, marveling at how children could find personal connections to centuries-old art without any self-consciousness about being wrong. After the tour, I walked to my favorite cafe for lunch, the one where Carmen now saved my usual table by the window on Tuesdays. She'd become more than just a friendly waitress. She was part of the community I'd gradually built around my new life, along with Frank from the pier, David from the docent training, and Elena from the poetry readings. "How'd the school group go?" Carmen asked, setting down my coffee without being asked. "Wonderful. Exhausting. Those kids see things we miss completely." "Speaking of seeing things differently," Carmen said, "there's someone I want you to meet." She nodded toward a man sitting alone at a corner table, reading what looked like a real estate magazine while eating soup. He was probably in his 70s, with silver hair and laugh lines that suggested someone who'd learned not to take life too seriously. "That's Robert Sullivan. He just moved here from Michigan, looking for a smaller place near the water. I told him you used to sell real estate, thought you might have some insights about the area." I glanced over at the man, who looked up from his magazine at that moment and smiled politely. There was something appealingly uncomplicated about his presence, the way he occupied space without apology or performance. "I'm not actively selling anymore," I reminded Carmen. "I know. But you could give him the local perspective. He seems nice, and he's been coming in here every day for a week looking a little lost." Before I could protest further, Carmen was walking over to Robert's table, gesturing in my direction. He looked over, nodded, and after a brief conversation with Carmen, approached my table with his coffee cup and that particular smile people wear when they're about to ask a favor from a stranger. "I'm sorry to interrupt your lunch," he said, "but Carmen mentioned you know the area well. I'm trying to figure out which neighborhoods might work for someone who wants to be near the water but doesn't need a palace." I gestured to the empty chair across from me. "I'd be happy to share what I know. Are you looking to buy or rent?" "Buy, eventually. But I'm in no hurry. My wife passed last year, and I decided I needed a complete change of scenery. Florida seemed like a good place to start over." There was something refreshingly direct about how he spoke about loss and change, without the careful language people often use when discussing difficult transitions. I found myself telling him about my own move to St. Petersburg, about discovering that starting over at our age was less about decline and more about expansion. We talked for over an hour about neighborhoods, property values, the difference between tourist areas and places where actual people lived their daily lives. Robert asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to my answers, treating my knowledge like expertise rather than casual conversation. "You really should get back into real estate," he said as we prepared to leave. "You obviously know what you're talking about, and you explain things in a way that makes sense." Walking back to my apartment, I found myself thinking about that suggestion. Carol Hendricks had said something similar months ago at the grocery store, and I dismissed it then as polite conversation. But lately, I'd been missing the satisfaction of matching people with places where they could flourish, the puzzle-solving aspect of real estate that had always energized me. That evening, I called Patricia to tell her about my day, about the school tour and the conversation with Robert Sullivan. "Sounds like the universe is sending you signals," she said. "Are you listening?" "I'm thinking about it. I need to update my license, learn about all the changes in the industry. It would be a lot of work." "Margaret, you're 69 years old and you just spent 6 months learning to be a museum docent, attending poetry readings, and building an entirely new life. I think you can handle updating a real estate license." The next morning, I woke up with unusual clarity about what I wanted to do. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, and began researching the requirements for reactivating my real estate license. The process was straightforward. Continuing education courses, background check, fees, nothing insurmountable for someone who'd already proven she could learn new skills. By noon, I'd enrolled in an online course that would bring my credentials current. By evening, I'd cleaned out a drawer to use as a home office space and begun making a list of contacts to reconnect with in the local real estate community. Helen knocked on my door around 7, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the expression of someone with news to share. "I sold a painting," she announced as soon as I opened the door. "An actual sale, to an actual stranger who paid actual money." We sat on my balcony celebrating her achievement while watching the sunset paint the sky in shades that would have made beautiful watercolors. Helen described the gallery owner's reaction, the buyer's enthusiasm, her own surprise at feeling like a legitimate artist rather than someone playing at creativity. "The best part," she said, "is that I painted it here, sitting on this balcony, looking at that exact view. So in a way, you were part of making it happen. When I told her about my decision to return to real estate, she raised her wine glass in a toast to second acts that turn out better than the first ones. 3 weeks later, Marcus called on a Sunday evening, something he'd been doing regularly since I'd moved out, no longer taking for granted that he knew how to reach me or what I might be doing with my time. "Mom, I have a question for you," he said. "A colleague at work is getting transferred here from Seattle. She's looking for someone to help her find a house, and I thought of you." "That's thoughtful, but I'm not actively selling yet. I'm still working on getting my license current." "Actually, that's not why I thought of you. I mean, yes, you'd be great at helping her, but what I really thought was that you'd understand what she's going through. Moving somewhere new, starting over, figuring out how to build a life from scratch." I was quiet for a moment, surprised by the insight. Marcus had watched me transform over the past months, and somehow he'd learned to see me as someone with valuable experience to offer, not just someone who needed to be managed or worried about. "Tell her to call me," I said. "Even if I can't officially represent her yet, I can at least give her the local perspective." "Thanks, Mom. And hey, Tyler wants to know if he can come visit next weekend. He's working on a school project about local history, and he thinks you'll know good places to research." After we hung up, I sat on my balcony thinking about how my relationship with Marcus and his family had evolved. I saw them regularly now, but as a choice rather than an obligation. I helped with the boys when asked, but as their grandmother rather than their automatic babysitter. Most importantly, Marcus had begun to see me as someone with expertise and wisdom to offer, not just someone whose mental capacity needed monitoring. The following Saturday, Tyler and I spent the morning at the St. Petersburg History Museum, where he interviewed a volunteer about the city's development, while I marveled at his confidence in asking thoughtful questions. Watching him take notes and engage seriously with adult conversation, I realized he was seeing me differently too. Not as the woman who lived in their guest house and managed their logistics, but as someone who knew interesting things and could guide him toward discoveries. That afternoon, I received my course completion certificate and submitted my application for license reactivation. By the end of the month, I'd be legally able to represent buyers and sellers again, though I planned to start slowly, taking clients who were genuinely seeking guidance rather than those just looking for the cheapest commission. Standing on my balcony that evening, watching boats navigate the channel toward the open water of the Gulf, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. 8 months ago, I'd been living in Marcus's guest house, managing his finances, existing quietly in the margins of someone else's life. I'd been the woman who forgot to take pills she wasn't prescribed and forgot to pay mortgages that weren't hers. Now I was someone else entirely. Someone who gave museum tours and attended poetry readings and helped neighbors celebrate sold paintings. Someone who was rebuilding a career not because she needed the money, but because she missed the work. Someone who had relationships with her family based on choice and mutual respect rather than obligation and convenience. I'd learned that forgetting to pay someone else's bills could be the first step toward remembering how to pay attention to your own life. That independence at 69 looked different from independence at 29, but it was no less valuable or necessary. Most importantly, I discovered that starting over wasn't about erasing the past or pretending to be someone new. It was about remembering who you'd always been, underneath all the roles and responsibilities and expectations that had accumulated over decades of living for other people's comfort. I was still Margaret Chen, still a mother and grandmother, still someone who'd been married for 40 years and widowed for 4. But I was also someone with her own apartment, her own schedule, her own reasons for getting up each morning that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs. And that, I realized, watching the lights begin to twinkle across Tampa Bay, was exactly who I'd forgotten I could be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.